have noted, our speaker today is Carmen Brevis, Dr. Brevis, and she's going to discuss educational interpreting, as you can see on the slide, as part of pedagogically sound teaching and learning. So especially about what do we do in the class, the SU classroom or all kinds of SU teaching. So Carmen actually started her career as an attorney, and she did that for more than 20 years and then came back to Stellenbosch University for a postgraduate diploma in translation. And from there, she did a master's degree in the law faculty with an action research approach. And she looked at academic literacy studies, especially the conditions for effective interpreting practices in a university lecture. And that was a master's in 2012. So it's very much what we're discussing today. She also dedicated her doctoral studies, which she got in 2020, to the process of interpreting in university lectures. And she specifically used the SU program as a case study. And the methodology she used there was ethnographic, which is a method that I think is becoming more and more interesting to many of us. So currently her role is that of a senior interpreter in our language center at Interpreting Services, and she coordinates the research portfolio. She also takes care of training and professional development of interpreters. So thanks so much for being with us, Carmen, and for sharing with us. And all of us are going to mute our mics, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Gerda. Well, firstly, a warm welcome from my side on behalf of all my colleagues in the interpreting team. For us in interpreting this topic of educational interpreting as that it has to be pedagogically sound is of critical importance. And it is really a privilege for me to speak to you about this topic today on behalf of my colleagues. So firstly, just to put multilingualism into practice and to give you an experience of interpreting, should you like to try that out, this session will be interpreted into Afrikaans. So our interpreter today is Eduard de Kok. You will find a link to the Afrikaans session in the chat here in this meeting. You can click on the link and you can go to the Afrikaans session. If you want to come back to this session, it's not difficult at all. There will be a link there back to the session. You can click on the link and voila, you're back into the session. So not difficult at all. So yes, firstly, I'd like to introduce you to the interpreting team. We currently have 12 Afrikaans, English Afrikaans interpreters. We have 2 sign language interpreters and we have 1 isiXhosa interpreter. Now, all our interpreters have postgraduate degrees, with the exception of 1 or 2. We've had experience in a university context as educational interpreters for up to or for around 10 years each. So we are very familiar with the university context and with the context in classrooms. Now, as you all know, the 2021 language policy, just as its predecessor, makes provision for educational interpreting in classrooms. Now, it can either be in situ, that refers to the face-to-face mode, or it can be online. And the objective or the reason for including that, amongst other things, is to satisfy the 3 main objectives that inform the language policy, namely access, multilingualism, and pedagogically sound teaching and learning. Now, the overall aim of today's presentation is to explore ways in which we can achieve greater and more effective cooperation with you, our lecturers. And to get there and to realize this ideal, we want to firstly give you more insight into the nature of interpreter-mediated teaching and learning and what it really is in practice that interpreters do. So, firstly, the interpreting service has been rolled out in 2011-2012, and Frans Pegakker said that your setting, he spoke about Stellenbosch now and South Africa, your setting is amongst the most fascinating in the current interpreting landscape. This is an extraordinary development in which South Africa leads the spoken language interpreting world. I just want to make sure, Gerda, is my sound still okay?
Yes, thanks. Let's just look for
Okay.
a colleague's thumbs up. I see Ramona's joining us. Can you hear okay? Yeah, lots of thumbs up. You can
Okay,
go.
because I hear that awful sound of, the losing the link. But in any case, okay, so I'm going
No,
to
it's
relax.
great. Sorry,
So I'm
it's
not.
just, Carmen, we haven't seen the link to the interpreting yet, though. Sorry to interrupt
Okay.
on that.
Okay, so I'm going to trust my colleague, Edward. Is there a problem with the interpreted lecture?
There's no problem, Carmen. The link is further up in the chat.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So just
Thank
scroll
you.
up. The link is there. Okay, so now you can have the real experience that our students have. So I don't want to spoil this quote, because this is always one of those quotes that if I write about interpreting, I start with this. Frans Pegakker, one of the most important scholars in interpreting studies worldwide, made this remark about interpreting when it was rolled out in Stellenbosch. Your setting is amongst the most fascinating in the current interpreting landscape. This is an extraordinary development in which South Africa leads the spoken language interpreting world. Now, interpreting as a process provides a very fertile area for any research, because it is interdisciplinary in nature. So you can take a theory from the social sciences and you can combine it with interpreting, like Van Zyl-Bekker did with demand control, or actor network theory in my case. And also, Stellenbosch University has the largest research output in spoken language educational interpreting in South Africa. So I'm not going to talk about what we did. I'm going to mention a few studies that are underway. Sanette Jager is looking at intonation and how the intonation of the educational interpreter differs from that of the lecturer. As we all know, intonation structures, tone structures a text. So she is going to investigate whether tone, in the case of the interpreter, is different. The magnitude of the pitch of the end of an utterance, and what the implications are for what we do and how we do it, and the amount of subject knowledge that is required. Chantal Ellis is looking at the technicality of text, the challenges provided by technical text, and also the strategies that are available and how to implement interpreting process more beneficially. Kanya van der Merwe in the department is doing a PhD currently. She's looking at language acquisition, and her aim of her research is to develop a model for training. So another important research project which has been done by the research team of the Interpreting Service. That was interview research. We tested perceptions of 23 users in 2019, and that article is going to be published later on this year in Spil Plus. Now, firstly, I have to tell you or discuss what makes educational interpreting different from interpreting in other contexts. The obvious fact that it is embedded in teaching and learning. So just like academic literacy studies, it lies on that intersection of language and learning. So it should be guided at all time by the tenets of education science, the whole ideas of that you know so well, student-centeredness, the importance of that, that we know that the student acts as a co-constructor in knowledge, that he or she is not passive but active in the process, the importance of a humanizing approach, of engagement of the student, the importance of affect, of creating a sense of belonging for that student, the importance of motivating that student, and the whole thing around agency, developing the agency and developing the identity of the student to become part of the community and practice and to start influencing that community. So we know from all the research that has been done on spoken language educational interpreting that it is vital to adhere to the orientations of these disciplines, and it is in fact conditional for its success and sustainability, and therefore the topic of today's speech. Now, interpreting is of course a complex process. Daniel Gilles said all interpreting is fundamentally difficult. It requires mental energy that is only available in limited supply. So when you interpret, you move right against the boundary of your capacity. And when there are more efforts or more challenges in the communication, that's where your product starts to deteriorate. Now, interpreting that we do here is, of course, in the simultaneous mode. It means that there is a short time lag between, say, 1 and 3 seconds between the lecturer and the interpreter. Issues that are central to simultaneous interpreting is obviously tone, the tone of the speaker, of the interpreter, the rhythm of the interpreted product, the time lag, as I mentioned, and obviously the fluency of the utterance. Now, a dynamic view of cognition that has only been written about fairly recently showed that interpreting is even more complex than we thought previously. It's not a linear system. It's not, you know, sender, receiver, and a linear line formation. You have to look at it as a complex system, and all these other factors play into the event, like environmental factors, like the acoustics in the room or noise from outside, sensory motor functions that has to do with the whole idea of embodied cognition, you know, the interpreter's bodily motor functions and sensory functions. We have to, in the online interpreting mode, work with technology all the time, which obviously presents multiple of challenges. Amongst others, while we are interpreting, we have to sometimes record, we have to share the screen, make sure that it shows optimally to the users, and we have to communicate with our colleague on WhatsApp. So the issue with all these challenges in the current context is if we start to move beyond our available capacity, we not only get information loss. That is not our biggest problem, losing a word here or there. We start losing the user. We start losing the student who listens to us and who depends on us for their teaching and learning experience. And so the function of the learning event can be jeopardized. So cooperation is a very important concept. Discourse studies has shown that even in seemingly monologic institutional events, there is always interaction and cooperation and rules for cooperation. And a monologic institutional event refers to where one person is in charge, like in a lecture. The lecturer decides what the substance of the talk is going to be, and the lecturer also decides what the progression is going to be. How many turns will there be? Who can speak? Who cannot speak? What they can say, you know, how long their turns can be, etc. So Bardenschuh in 1998 did very important research in interpreting studies by analyzing move by move and utterance by utterance in institutional communicative events, that the interpreter is in fact an active participant in the event, that she or he co-constructs meaning, and that the interpreter uses evidence provided by participants in the event, by everything in the event, to construct this message. So the linear model, the conduit model of speech is not very useful when we want to know what is really happening. So in reality, the interpreter, willingly or unwillingly, ends up taking responsibility both for the substance and the progression of talk. So the responsibility for an interpreted lecture is actually divided between the lecturer and between the interpreter. And I will show you shortly what I mean by this. So the fact of the matter is that the person in charge loses some of his or her control, and the interpreted lecture is in fact a different lecture. Now, why is this the case? Because the relationship between languages, because concepts or terms are often described in different languages from different vantage points. A word in French, for example, will focus more on what the thing does, while the same word in English might focus more on the characteristics of that concept or word. Languages, as we know, are not isomorphic. They differ in form and structure, and therefore to directly translate something can cause confusion. And we as interpreters experience it on a daily basis, that we fail our students if we try to translate directly all the time. So what do? We add words or phrases, we clarify, we use other options because we have linguistic flexibility, synonyms, whatever. We explicate, we put into context, we make the relevance of a statement overt, we link ideas, improve cohesion in a text, we split sentences, we give specific examples. So we do what we call framing and focusing moves. We make overt how an utterance relates to the rest of the text. So the reality of human cognition and of interpreting and of all communication is that participants in communication make active decisions. They're not stagnant. Like Munoz Martin said in a 2021 text that he wrote, all humans are active navigators within and partial managers of their environment, rather than passive bystanders, mechanically and aseptically storing, retrieving, and logically manipulating, relaying symbols, rules, plans. So to expect of an interpreter to be the exception is not realistic. So Munoz Martin refers to this thing which is also inherent in communication, that affect and emotion overrides reason in communication. And he speaks about cognitive and affective perspective taking and empathy. That ability to adopt and to simulate the mental states of others, which is of course extremely important for multilingualism and to make it real. So what is the relationship between a source and a target text? It's more one of correspondence rather than equivalence. Equivalence is a problematic concept. And Christiane Nord's idea of functionalism, that the function of the source text should correlate with the function of what the users of the interpreting is experience. Now, to explain to you what will happen, for instance, in a lecture. In one lecture, the lecture was, of course, in English, and the lecturer referred to the JSC, the Judicial Services Commission. So the interpreter interpreted in this case, this is empirical examples, the JSC to link that word to the English abbreviation. In Afrikaans, die RDK, die Regterlike Dienskommissie. So the user knows what term to expect in the textbook because the textbook is English, and when she speaks to her English friends or whatever the case might be, she knows now what the English abbreviation is. She also knows what the correct equivalent is, and she knows what it denotes, what it stands for. Another example, the lecturer will say something like constitutional supremacy, and the interpreter goes, die oppergesag van die grondwet, anders as waar die parlement die oppergesag is, wat die vroeëre stelsel was. So this concept that we went from a parliamentary supremacy to constitutional supremacy is very important at the moment. It's all over in the news, and it has been dealt with in the course of all the lectures in this module. So the interpreter is merely repeating, just to put everything into context, which has been the previous system. With other words, now we have a constitutional supremacy. The lecturer will say something like, in a case, meaning a court case, there's a lot of documents. And the interpreter goes or says, daar is baie dokumente, prosesdokumente in 'n saak. Because the interpreter knows that the interpreter in this case is a subject specialist, and the interpreter knows that the lecturer is actually speaking of process. So what happens here is that a first-year law student hears these things in very early on in the term, which I think is extremely valuable and beneficial for the learning process. Another example, the lecturer mentioned the BRICS countries, and then she gave 3 of the countries that form part of the BRICS countries. So the interpreter repeated those 3 countries, but then she included a 4th country. And then she says, South Africa is also one of the BRICS countries, because she knows that by saying that, the whole point of the remark of the lecturer will become clear. Now, remember in situ interpreting, as it's called by the language policy, or face-to-face interpreting, the user of the interpretation can always check whether the interpreter is correct, because she still hears the voice of the lecturer on the background. Whereas in online interpreting, they only hear the interpreter. So when the interpreter doesn't say enough or isn't correct, whatever the case might be, the interpreter might lose the trust of a user, because the user might now think that it's the interpreter that makes the mistake. Another example, the lecturer said the bar, the interpreter said die balie, waar die advokate is. We were doing jurisdiction, and the interpreter thought that it was important to just add something to make it clear. We're now in the realm of the High Court, where the advocates are. That's what die balie is. Bill of Rights, the interpreter says, die handves van regte, bill hier is nie 'n wetsontwerp nie. Because remember, when an act, before it's promulgated, is still in the conceptual phase, it's called a bill. But die Handves van Regte is also called or translated to English by the concept Bill of Rights. So the interpreter anticipated that there might be confusion and clarified for the user. So what happened in this instance was later on in that same lecture, one of the students in the venue put up a hand and seemed perplexed by this aspect as well. And you can just imagine the value that users of the interpretation experience when they realize that the interpreter was correct and that they have correctly anticipated their thought processes, put them in their shoes. What we also do in online lectures is we talk directly to our users because there are silences, they only hear us, so there are silences that they might not understand what's going on and they might be left out. So we explain what is happening. There might be problems with the technology, or there might be various conversations going on that we can't hear, whatever the case might be. So the effects of this we have seen is that it's a positive emotive experience for users. They experience a sense of belonging. They experience trust in the interpreting process. Research has shown that it allays their second language anxiety because they put at ease. And if we don't give them this, we fear that they might feel disadvantaged and excluded, and that all that we're doing is actually not real multilingualism, but just duplicate a sense of unbelonging. So what did we see in our research project in the interpreting team? Our users told us that they consider a quality interpreting product to be the following. The interpreter must sound as if she knows the subject field. She must sound scientific. Then she must have a tone of authority. She must anticipate students' needs. It's okay to intercede on the user's behalf in the class, for example, by asking the lecturer a question directly to clarify a concept or something. Then, if she concludes the lecturer's utterance where needed, they appreciated that. It enhanced their learning. Sometimes the interpreter will summarize something quickly or clarify content or whatever. They also appreciate it and have a positive experience when there's visible engagement between a lecturer and an interpreter about the lecturing process. What is the exact terminology that you want me to use? How are we going to sort out the technical issues or the whole issue about repeating questions? So we feel that there should be more cooperation, but how should this be done or on what topics? Firstly, language use in the lecture. It should be planned between the lecturer and the interpreter. Secondly, the various processes of the learning and teaching and the interpret lecture, and then learning outcomes. Now, what are examples of these discussions or points for discussion when it comes to language planning? Firstly, how's the interpreting or the interpreting service, the interpreter, going to be introduced? Use the correct terminology. Then how is multilingualism going to be implemented? What can the lecturer do to sign a buy-in into interpreting to students who are not familiar enough academically for the source language? Then is the lecturer going to repeat content in Afrikaans? Some lecturers repeat everything in Afrikaans, basically signing that the interpret lecture is redundant. Then how are we going to put speakers of other languages at ease? Are we going to use formal or plain language? How about translanguaging? Talk about language strategies to create a plurilingual environment where languages interact. So what can we do in the lecture to bring the various languages into contact with one another? What are the language needs of this specific group? Remember, the lecturer has background knowledge. Is there a need for isiXhosa in the classroom? How are we going to address this? How are we going to deal with technical terms? How are we going to deal with translation of slides? Are we going to have two separate sets? Are we going to have causa on the slide? Are we going to give equal exposure to all the languages in one set of slides, or is the interpreter going to use a separate set in the interpret lecture? How about process? So, what should the interpreter status in Teams be? It should be a presenter status because the interpreter needs to speak into the main lecture or use the chat. How is the chat function going to be handled? If it's the lecturer's choice that it should be disabled, we can respect that, but then everybody needs to talk about the effect of disabling a chat for the interpreted lecture. Is the interpreter allowed to stop the lecturer to speak into the main lecture? Is the print on the PowerPoint slides legible? Word missing there, legible. Can it be read? Then how about the speech rate? If the lecturer is speaking extremely fast, interpreting can become even faster, and that should be a point of discussion between the lecturer and his or her interpreter. How are lecturing aids going to be used? Any lecturing aid in the classroom. Is the lecturer going to use a video? We can share video, but it will be nice if we can know that there's going to be video and that we can watch the video beforehand and decide, should we translate it, should we just share it, or what? How's the sound in the lecture going to be handled? What microphone is the best for the interpreters? How is a breakaway or are breakaway groups going to be handled? Often we experience that in our interpreted lectures, there is no provision made for the users of the interpreting. There is no link provided for them. So that we then say to our group in the interpreted lecture, you can treat this as a breakaway group. We will not listen to you, which is awkward and not necessary. It can be handled better. Then, how are questions going to be treated? Now, obviously, we understand that it is just more effort on the side of the lecturer to now remember the whole question while she's trying to work out how she should answer the question. But it's not necessary to repeat everything. If you answer a question and you frame it in such a way that the question becomes overt, that the context becomes overt, it's perfect for us. We can work with that. So how are we going to treat questions of the users in the interpreting? What we're doing currently is we copy and paste the remark or the question in the chat of the interpreted lecture into the main lecture. Maybe the lecturer wants us to alert her to that immediately by speaking into the main lecture, making the user feel more comfortable or more at home in the whole process. Then instances where lecturers walk around, which you see less in online lectures, or having aside conversations. So what are lecturers going to do during the process? To show students that she or he thinks of them, that they are kept in mind. And just keep in mind that by improving this, there's also a benefit for everybody that listens to the streamed lecture, not only the users of the interpreting service. So what is a typical technical issue that we can encounter? Something like this. So we are in a streamed lecture, but we all of a sudden, the interpreters realize we cannot use the chat function. We do not have access to the chat in the main lecture. So we cannot put the link into the main lecture, and we can also not paste the questions or remarks of our users into the main chat. So it becomes evident during the course of the lecture that students who are listening to the streamed lecture can also not use the chat function. We hear that students are trying to get the attention of the lecturer. You hear them going, "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am," but the lecturer doesn't seem to hear the students. We as interpreters have no means to get the attention of the lecturer. We can also not speak into the main lecture. We try to say something and hope that somebody will hear us, which is very awkward for us to do and actually takes a lot of effort in that moment. We cannot hear questions in the class. We have no way to alert the lecturer and ask her to repeat the questions. Our users obviously have no idea what is going on. And the lecturer keeps on wondering and expresses this why nobody is asking anything in the streamed lecture. So we contemplate WhatsApping each other, me and my co-interpreter. How are we going to deal with the situation? But remember all the efforts. Remember that you have a limited capacity. So we are also not sure in a situation like that what our role is, what the correct thing is to do. There's no real consensus on this. It has never been discussed with our lecturer. So what should we discuss around learning outcomes? You as a lecturer can give your interpreter insight into the context of the module. How does this module fit into the larger context of the course? You can talk about preparation material. How can you use your preparation material the best? What is the structure that lecturers will follow? How to improve interaction in a lecture. That's also a learning outcome, is the amount of interactions, and it should be discussed. Also of the users. How can you get contact between yourself, the interpreter, and the student? Cecilia Bardens, she calls interpreting a dance by three, and it is what it is. So in our research project in the interpreting team, our users, or the users that we interviewed, said, we'd like to actually have an opportunity to speak to both the lecturer and the interpreter, you know, in the same meeting, so we can flesh out certain issues. Why can't the lecturer and the interpreter not listen to the recording of the interpreter together, so that the lecturer knows what the interpreter is doing in her class? If she doesn't like it, she can change it. And they can discuss it, and they can reach an understanding on this. And they can discuss their users' needs. You know, what exactly do these users need? Do they only want recordings? How are they listening to the recordings? Are they even listening to the recordings? Stuff like that. How can the lecturer show the users that they are part of the event? We had this example in a lecture where the lecturer in the main language or in the main lecture referred the students to the Padlet, and she put a link in the chat. And, you know, how about if she says, interpreter, just remember to also put this link in the chat of the interpreted lecture, so that she can show that she endorses multilingualism, and so that we can all make multilingualism real. So just by ending, four important remarks that I think is important. The first is to ensure that interpreting is part of pedagogically sound teaching and learning. We first need to realize that quality and professionalism is a cooperative endeavor. The interpreter can be as good as she or he can be, but if there's no cooperation, you will still get failure. You will still run the risk of excluding your students and, you know, realizing the whole function of the lecture. So it's all of our co-responsibility to implement the values of multilingualism. It's something we should talk about and which we should all take responsibility for. In the beginning, I said that the owner of the event, the person who is in charge, like the lecturer, the reality is that he or she loses some control. Now, I want to end by saying that if you work with your interpreter, you paradoxically gain back most of your control. That's the best way in which you can have control in the reality of an interpreted lecture. And the fourth thing is, I've mentioned a lot that it is complex processes, but remember that we are professionals. Just as you are professionals, we know our subject matter, we know our practice. We've been doing this for 10 years. We can do it, but we can do it better if we do it with you. So yes, that's basically it. I included a reference list at the end. You're welcome to have a look at that. There's also a link there to the Language Centre's Multilingual Mindset page. And yes, that's it from my side. Thank you very much. So Gerda, over to you.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I don't know if you can see the responses on your screen, but there's a lot of hands clapping.
Thank you.
I would like to know if one of those hands would go up in the form of a question or a comment. Colleagues, please, let's hear your voices. While we're waiting for a hand or a mic to open or a comment to appear, I want to pick up on, there's a hand. Thank you. Let me see who you are. That is so wonderful. It's Kim. Hello,
It's
Kim.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd just like to kick off by congratulating Carmen on a superb lecture. She made some really complex theoretical concepts easy to understand, and I hope that we can really work on the cooperation between lecturers and interpreters. Thank you so much, Carmen.
Thanks, Kim. Great, thanks.
Thanks, Kim. And what about a question or a comment from there on that collaboration point? The way ahead for collaboration, how do we see it from Language Centre?
Gerda, are you waiting for Kim to answer? Or can I answer?
No, you're welcome.
Carmen, I think you should answer.
Okay, okay. I remember when I collected data for my PhD, I spoke to an excellent lecturer in engineering, and we spoke about this issue, and he said that it would be great for him if his interpreter, and by the way, I didn't mention this, but you as a lecturer has got the full right to ask who your interpreter is going to be in the session. Obviously, we can't guarantee that you always have the same interpreter, but we follow a policy of specialization. And I can promise you that the reality in the interpreting team and processes now is that we all interpret in certain or specialize in certain contents. So the lecturer said to me that why can't his interpreter come to him on a Friday afternoon and just pop into his office and speak about the week, and he can mention something if he heard something, or he can say what he plans for the next week or stuff like that. Now, I know that lecturers are extremely busy, but it is about will and intention. And it's again that thing of, can we really afford not to? So I just think that, and now these days it can be done online. So there's no reason why you cannot create a Teams meeting once every term, or maybe every second week, and cannot discuss these issues with all the interpreters in the small pool that are interpreting your module. So that's what I would propose as a starting point.
Thank you so much. So it sounds almost as if it has a lot to do with the human element and more connection between the humans, the colleagues, if I hear you right, Carmen?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's humanity or human engagement is important before the class, it's important in the class, it's important after the lecture, yes.
And then we see your colleague, Mevrouw van Wyk, also talking to the same point about the touching point, the connection. Thanks for your point there, colleague van Wyk. And then we have a hand up. Sanet, yeah, thanks. You can speak, Sanet. Somehow we can't hear you yet, Sanet. I can see your mic is open, but...
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, fantastic. Sorry about that. My mic was not plugged in. Rookie mistake. I'd like to add something, Carmen, if you don't mind, from the multilingualism perspective. And just hold on, I need to exit the other meeting. I'm listening to my colleague Edward as well in the interpreting. Okay. So from the multilingualism perspective, I think one of the things we need to realize is that we want people to buy into the idea that multilingualism is necessary. It's not an extra, it's necessary. So we're not practicing multilingualism at the university because of feel-good feelings. We're practicing it because it's a human right. So we are wanting to tell people we value you regardless of the language you speak. We value your entire person in whatever form you speak your language. And interpreting is part of acknowledging that right in people. So I think lecturers and the entire SU community also needs to get to that point where we realize that we're not playing a multilingualism game here. We're doing serious business with multilingualism. So buy into that idea and collaborate with your interpreters as a necessary point of professionalism. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good point. Absolutely.
Very nice point. Then we see Ramona asking, how long in advance do you have to arrange for an interpreter? I see Juanli answering that, but you can open the mic. Even a few days.
Thank you very much, Fada.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes, I answered that any amount of time is possible, but even a few days can still be enough. So if anyone's interested in having interpreters in their classroom, whether online or otherwise later in the year, they can just contact us and we'll have a conversation about it. If I can just take the opportunity to answer, I see two related questions in the chat as well. Susan, one of our former interpreters, asked it, and it relates to something that Dr. Anita Jonker said as well. So yes, interpreters do work with people, not just with words, although we work with words as well. But this past semester and these past few years, actually, we've been interpreting online. So our real-time online interpreting has been how we address the issues of remaining a multilingual university while working from home. And at the moment, we do not have the capacity to work in the classroom. We don't have enough interpreters. We don't have the capacity or the resources. So at the moment, online interpreting works for us because there is still lecturing happening in the online realm or on Microsoft Teams. So for now, that is how we're addressing these issues. But if the university moves back to face-to-face lectures completely, or things change in the second semester, that might mean changes for us as well. So we consider all the factors and all the practical implications when we make these decisions, but for now it's not practical otherwise. And I have to say that it really works quite well. So we do have had to overcome some challenges, but I think this has been quite a good answer, and that's the feedback that we get as well. Of course, there are rooms that are more difficult to interpret in than others, and the one that Dr. Jonker is referring to, there's a specific lecture room where there are always issues with the sound, but that's one lecture room out of all the others that we interpret in, so we try to address this as they come up.
Thanks, Juanle. There's also a question from Margriet. Have you had more attendance because you're online? And can I go straight ahead? There's 3 more questions. One from accountancy saying, how do you deal with a lecturer that prefers writing under a document camera as the lecture? Oh, that's an interesting one.
So,
would you like
Jean-Lee? Yeah, that first question definitely, yeah. The uptake, yeah.
Yes, well, what is interesting is, yes, that we do see more students making use of our services now that our services are online. So if it is, we do see that students don't feel as othered in the process, which was an issue in the past. So for the moment, we see students listening to our recordings. We see students joining us in the classrooms where 1 or 2 Afrikaans students might have joined us in person. Before COVID, now we see 10 or more in some lectures. We have 30+ students in some modules that make use of our services. So that's quite interesting, that students find it easier, because remember, interpreting helps them make notes more easily. It helps them understand the concepts or learn the terminology in 2 languages, especially if they'll be working in 2 languages one day. In terms of the second question, if a lecturer prefers the camera while writing on the screen, that's not an issue at all. As long as you voice what you are sharing with the students, it can be interpreted. So whichever way or mode of teaching you prefer, as long as you verbalize it, what is verbalized can be interpreted. We just do not do sight interpreting as such. So if you are only making use of notes without any sound, that's a job for a translator and not an interpreter. We don't sight interpret, we interpret what is said. So just verbalize your thoughts and we'll share it with the students.
Yes.
You can add, Carmen.
Yes, remember, we share the screen in Teams. We have 2 Teams meetings, as you probably know, the main lecture and then the interpreted lecture. And we share the screen of the main lecture. So the students that listen to the interpretation see exactly what the students see who are following the streamed lecture in English. So if the document camera is set up in such a way that the students can see it, then the users can also see it. But those are the things that should be discussed beforehand, that there are no glitches, that it doesn't catch the interpreter unawares, and that we can do it the best we can for the greatest benefit of the students.
Thanks, and I see Sanette showing that with an image on screen. So we certainly see that kind of interaction and collaboration among you, among the interpreters, as you wish to see among all of us, among lecturers and interpreters, the 3-way dance that you're discussing. We also see from Stephen and Margriet a discussion point where he expresses his respect for your work. Thank you for that, for the point you made, Stephen. there was no difference in content and feel between the story of the lecturer and the story of the interpreter, and it certainly convinced him that it can work and works very well. And he also expresses admiration. Not sure how you do it. And again, it's that point you made earlier about that you interpret so much more than words, that you also interpret tones and silences. And then there's a question from Sanette. What can lecturers do to destigmatize using interpreting? How do you see it, Carmen? How can we, I just want to also acknowledge Debbie's point earlier that Debbie says it has a lot to do with the role of the lecturer and how the lecturer regards the role. She says this comes back to the issue of what some lecturers believe their role is, regardless of what is indicated in policy. Yeah, thanks. I mean, you can.
That might be so. That might be so. What was the first part of the question? How can lecturers? That Sanette asked. Yeah, I cannot see the chat. Remember,
lecturers. What can lecturers do to destigmatize the use of interpretation?
Well, 1,000 things. For one, they can speak to the interpreter directly. They can acknowledge the existence of the interpreted lecture. Firstly, before I say anything else, there is cooperation between some interpreters and their lecturers, and it is something that has grown considerably since the inception of the service. But it is something that has remained superficial to a large extent, you know, greeting the interpreter or saying thank you very much to the interpreter doing a great job. Obviously, that is great, but we need much more than that. We need it to be functional, to speak about those three aspects that I mentioned, you know, language planning and the outcomes of the learning. And that is something that can be discussed between the interpreter and the lecturer. How are you going to show that you endorse interpreting? By things like the Padlet example that I mentioned, by saying to the interpreter, remember to place the link in the interpreted lectures chat as well. Things like that, to handle breakaway rooms differently, to just sign buy-in and to sign to the user of the service that they are part of the whole language event, the lecture. Yeah. Just be real about it. Have the emotion of being real about it. Emotions override reason in communication. So just be real about it and actually show what you feel, you know, for the users as well, not only the few people sitting in front of you.
And I think if I hear you right, an important point you're making is that it's not about how you want to feel as interpreters, but how the student is encouraged to feel part of the class and not feeling stigmatized. And then I see Margriet. Sorry, you're welcome to expand on that, Carmen.
No, there's not much I also wanted to say, but you know, role in interpreting is a very important aspect. So how are we seen by our users? What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to do in a lecture, and are we doing it? Are we delivering on those role expectations? So in that regard, we need clarity. We need clarity from the lecturer. This is okay to do this. I like it when you do this. You're welcome to do this. Or do not do this. It makes me nervous. Let's agree not to do this. And the interpreters will respect that. But that conversation needs to take place. That, you know, you have to manage role expectations. That's actually the point. And that will make interpreters feel a lot better, I can promise you.
Yes. And it seems to me that a lot of the support you offer will then be more available to the lecturers simply by hearing about it. Now, Carmen, there's a very interesting discussion that Margriet started by asking about how did things change when you went online? Do you think, you know, due to COVID, the pandemic, working online mainly, did it make things better? And then Sanette responded yes, in the sense that the student had more anonymity, they're not exposed, but no, in the sense that it doesn't really stigmatize it. It sort of sidesteps the student. And then Van Wyk, colleague, you also
Jackie
wanted to, is it Jackie? Jackie, please let's open your mic and let's hear your point there. About the microphone.
I'm sorry, I'm in a very noisy place, so maybe if you can just relay my message. Thanks.
Okay, so Jackie was saying, what they can't hear as interpreters, they can't interpret. So if students ask a question in the lecture, they have to use a microphone. And so a lot of the educational contents gets lost when they can't hear their question and they can't hear the contribution from students in class. So it seems to me it has a lot to do about the welcoming nature of SU, as I think Sanette also reminded us that we're not doing this because we like to, but because we have to be that human rights orientated. So if I'm quickly squeezing, looking for more questions and comments. Yeah, I think another important one is that Margriet said the simultaneous talk translation or interpreting, sorry, that Edward did was working very well, and she's expressing respect and amazement for that. And then also Margriet says quite simply the lecturer can repeat the question, which is a good practice in any case. Margriet, would you like to expand on your thoughts there? You've made a great contribution, so that's why it would be nice to hear your voice.
Hello, Margriet.
Hello, Carmen. So sorry for hogging the chat. I do have a very loud dog and a few birds in the background, so just ignore, please. No, I was just thinking that there are so many good practices that we take for granted. For instance, simply repeating a question that a student asks, also to make sure that it's a clarifying of that question, could be helpful to a interpreter in that regard. And also because if we know that sound often fails us or tech often fails us, knowing that we can sidestep that, we don't need a roaming mic, also in times of COVID. And so those little practices, also asking ourselves, what is it that I take for granted within my teaching practice that I need to zone in perhaps on a bit more, that can be beneficial to my students, to my interpreter, and it's something that won't cost me any extra stress or any extra input. So that's actually all I meant. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Wow, thanks. Yeah, Carmen, you want to add?
Yeah, no, that's very important, that whole zone in things. Sometimes it's just a matter of really thinking, putting yourself into the shoes, that effective perspective taking. Putting yourself into the shoes of the student who has to follow online. Because remember, if the users of the interpretation cannot hear the question, the users of the, or the listeners of the in the main lecture who use the stream lecture, they can also not hear. So it is critical for lecturers to repeat a question. And sometimes students can use whole paragraphs to ask a question, or it's not even clear what they're asking. So all that the lecturer then has to do is just to provide a phrase or to just structure the answer in such a way that the context becomes clear. And that is in any case a very good pedagogical principle. So it's important for everybody in the classroom, but because you can remember from your student days, if a student asks a question, often you just zone out and it's far from you, you can't hear it, whatever the case might be. So it is in any event critically important. But now where the problem comes in, we now ask the lecturer afterwards in an email to do that. Then the lecturer comes back to the next lecture, and because a lot of things come into play, because just like with us, there are so many distractions and challenges in the communication that she forgets. Now role comes into play. What should you do now? Can you speak into the main lecture? Because it's hair-raising to do it. But can you do it? Will the lecturer be okay with this? If you remind her in front of all her students, ma'am, please or Professor so-and-so, please just repeat the question, or didn't hear the question, or something like that. Because, you know, typing into the text, you're interpreting, you want to sign to your co-interpreter, please do that, or whatever the case might be, their role comes in. And that's why this effective, real cooperation, working as partners, is so important.
Interesting. Again and again, we see it's about people. Perspective taking is such an important thing you leave us there with. Susanne wants to add, and I'm hoping, Susanne, you also respond to LZ's point in the chat, that asking a bit more clarity about that stigma.
Oh, yes. Interesting. Remember, speaking, I just wanted to say that Carmen said initially, remember, if the interpreter can't hear, most of the people in the class can't hear either. So if some student asks a question sitting right at the back, and the lecturer walks up the, let's say it's the lecturer room in Arts and Social Sciences building, then the people at the behind her, her back, can't hear either. So that's just what I wanted to say. The problem is with a demand, what we talk of, if you can't get to the capacity, say something, terminology is unknown to the interpreter. Now the interpreter makes a decision. Now that decision must be an ethical one, in the sense of, if she does put her hand up to interrupt the lecturer, there can be a constellation of demands following. It could be good or bad. The lecturer can use her train of thought. They can they actually maybe don't want something answered, and we don't know that. So it's very, very thin line. It's very dangerous to make that decision without clarifying that beforehand with the lecturer. So to walk in blind into a lecture room is very unethical, I would say, from a perspective of when do you make what decision on a line from continuing from 1 to 10, where 1 is a very conservative decision to not say anything, where the educational moment is gone forever, and 10 being a very liberal one, which can also be demanding for the lecturer or the student, in the sense that they lose their train of thought. With regards to in the stigma, my daughter is a 3rd year student at Stellenbosch. So I'm asking her quite a bit about what she thinks, and I think that the big gap in research currently is the fact that we don't know. A lecturer knows what we are lecturing, but we don't know what the student is learning. Now, to figure out what it is that they take away from a interpreted lecture, I think it has to be lecture has to be totally in the hands of us, just to figure out what do they need from us to be effective, for us to be effective in their teaching and learning process, because every single student differs. It's a very complex system, as we said before. It's not about language. If it was a simple linear solution. That's role driven, and also that role, you slip in and out of that, of different roles all the time, and every single utterance, it can differ from clarifier to a conduit model. My big thing with role and the stigma with a student is the fact that they say, I am bilingual. And it dates back to the accent and all these things. They don't feel free to ask questions then in Afrikaans. So they would rather struggle through an English lecture than to be labeled as not bilingual or not so cool because you have to listen. I think in that sense, the online interpreting is great, but I do think that podcasts is still the best answer for them to go back and to listen to it again and again and again, and where the interpreter also have more time to clarify certain things, because you can actually edit the podcast. It's more like a translation than an interpreted lecture, because I do think that our program, our model, is more a conduit model, whereas we all know that the conduit model for the role of the interpreter is totally inadequate. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you so much, Carmen. It was lovely, but I have to run.
Thanks, Susanne. And we all almost have to run. We only have 2 more minutes, and Juanli wants to make a point. Yes.
Thank you, Gerda. I just wanted to expand on the question from Magritte, and I see Sanet answered it so beautifully about it wasn't Magritte's question, LZ's question about the stigma situation. So yes, there definitely is a little bit of stigma connected to it, but it's a stigma that's really projected from a personal perspective. So it's not a general stigma, but certain people project their own perspectives on the interpreting interaction. So there's the stigma that Afrikaans students make use of English and of interpreting in English modules because they don't understand English, or because they're not clever, or they need extra help. So it's remedial, it's a little bit of extra. While that is the furthest thing from the truth. We had the same situation when we were still interpreting from Afrikaans into English, where for example, in the engineering faculty, there were students who came from Swaziland who'd never been exposed to any Afrikaans before. So they were learning in a foreign language, but they gained their master's degrees in electronic engineering while making use of interpreting services for 4 years, because they're incredibly intelligent, but they make use of our services to add to their comprehension because of the language barrier, not the understanding barrier or the intelligence barrier. And then there's the thing where lecturers and students sometimes tend to think that interpreting is a political act. We alluded to it earlier, where there's this thing that we interpret, it's just for window dressing so that we can say this is a multilingual campus, while that is also not the truth. We don't interpret because we want to make people feel better about their own perception of multilingualism. We interpret because there's a practical need for a more multilingual way of communicating for students who have needs that aren't addressed by monolingual lectures. So we're not making a political statement by interpreting into Afrikaans. For us, it's not necessarily about saving Afrikaans from termination or anything like that that's often projected onto interpreting or any efforts for multilingualism. It's more about the practicalities of there's a need, so we address it by using our talents to build a bridge between explanation and understanding. And that's not necessarily political, but it is something that we're passionate about, and that's the promotion of this multilingual way of communicating on our campus.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm afraid I have to say goodbye, colleagues. But if you don't mind, I'm going to try and do two things and ask Debbie to say goodbye and say your thing, Debbie. And then I also just want to thank you so much, Carmen, for a lovely presentation.
Pleasure.
And lots of
Pleasure.
participation from it.
Great pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Debbie, please say goodbye. You can speak.
Hi everybody. And yeah, the one thing that I just wanted to say about the politicization of the interpreting services, I do think that this is something that is very real, and that we need to figure out how to address, because there definitely is a perception and an undermining of it. That's my perception in terms of trying to politicize it. Whereas, I mean, speaking to the interpreters and working with them, I mean, that is not the agenda at all. So I'm not sure how we do that, but it is something that we should think about. Okay, thanks everyone.
We need to come. Thanks, Debbie. I think Kim sort of supported the point that Carmen was making, and that was, let's talk to our interpreters before the class. I think a whole lot of good things will come from that. Absolutely. And that's where we're going to leave it.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gerda. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, Carmen.
Take care. Thank you,
Bye.
Carmen.
Thank you, everybody. Pleasure.